The World Tourism and Council Summit is underway in Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda. Now, this is the first time that the World Travel and Tourism Council Global Summit will take place in Africa. Known for its commitment to sustainable tourism and biodiversity conservation, Rwanda is using the opportunity to highlight the power of sustainable tourism to protect biodiversity and build thriving communities.
Now, the WTTC's annual Global Summit is the most influential travel and tourism event on the calendar. And of course, this year, industry leaders are gathered with key government representatives to continue aligning efforts to support the sector's recovery and move beyond to a safer, more resilient, inclusive and sustainable future. The summit has over 45 countries in attendance, including Burundi's Vice President Prosper Bazombaza and Tanzanian President Samia Suluhu Hassan.
Now, WTTC President and CEO Julia Simpson revealed that the global travel and tourism sector is making a robust comeback, bouncing back to the pre-pandemic vigor of 2019.
The much-anticipated World Travel and Tourism Council Summit is a historic moment for Africa as it hosts the event for the first time. And this platform will see countries coming together to discuss strategies to promote tourism globally. Rwandan President Paul Kagame highlighted the country's incredible resilience and progress.
We should not lose sight of our own continental market. Africans are the future of global tourism as our middle class continues to grow at a fast pace in the decades to come. We must work closely together with partners like you to continue developing Africa into a premier destination for global travel.
The summit also shed light on Rwanda's remarkable transformation and how it serves as a model for sustainable development across the continent. Moreover, Rwanda's dedication toward conservation and wildlife management has yielded impressive results. The country's effort in protecting endangered species such as the mountain gorillas have attracted attention worldwide. As other nations participate in this summit, they will surely learn valuable lessons in sustainable conservation practices.
In the 1980s, there were under 200 mountain gorillas left on this planet. They were on the brink of extinction from poaching and from deforestation. Today, there are over 1,600. They know that because they do a census every year. And the reason the gorillas were saved is actually really simple. Travel and tourism.
As the summit progresses, ideas will be shared, alliances formed, and a collective commitment to the future of global tourism is beginning to shape up. The summit serves as a catalyst, igniting the momentum needed to create a thriving and responsible industry.
If Africa is to rely on natural attractions, it is imperative that we should prioritize conservation and support efforts to preserve cultural sites, artifacts, and traditions, and to ensure they remain accessible for generations to come.
With Rwanda being at the forefront of this summit shows that Africa is being recognized. And it is clear that Africa is also ready to welcome businesses and visitors from all corners of the world. Obongani Siziba for News Central TV, Kigali, Rwanda.
Now joining us this morning to speak further on the summit is Dr. Adun Okupe. She's from the Red Clay Advisory. Good morning, Dr. Okupe. Thank you very much for your time.
Good morning, Olive.
All right, we'd like you to take us through the happenings. You're currently in Kigali, Rwanda. Take us through the happenings of the WTTC annual summit. What's going on there, and how would you say the reception is for the very first time it's coming to Africa.
Right, exactly. And I would say that it's showing that Africa is ready for tourism, and no better place to start than Rwanda. So the summit has had quite an amazing turnout in terms of people from all corners of the world. It's been great for networking. It's been great to also see how people are moving forward the boundaries of tourism, particularly after the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the post-COVID phase, it's also been quite enlightening in terms of how we can develop strategies to move forward as a continent.
Well, first, it's really interesting, well, and of course, pretty telling when you said what better place to start than Rwanda. I'm sure that Nigerians are weeping with that because, we've had a lot of opportunities that, maybe wasted a lot of opportunities to fix the structure, with regards to tourism and travel here in the country, but sadly, no. But I want you to talk about some of the main things that have been spoken about over there. What does the continent lack, with infrastructure that would have really needs to be fixed if we need to improve on travel and tourism to the continent? What level of visa laws need to be also adjusted or changed to fix some of that also?
Right. So just to say, in terms of Nigeria, right, and in terms of how Rwanda has shown it's ready, right? The Kigali Convention Center has been an exceptional venue and a destination. But that said, we have had some delegates from Nigeria. We have the Director of Domestic Tourism here representing the Minister of Tourism, and we have a couple of tourism practitioners. So it's also been great to see Nigerians also coming here to kind of contribute to the conversation. And Red Clay was fortunate to be invited to the Advisors Circle for WTTC, where we shared, what should the focus areas be for the World Travel and Tourism Council going forward, and what should it look like for tourism leaders going forward? And my submissions were that we need to look at staff. We need to look at the skilling of staff. And what we mean by that is not only at the entry level, but also at the middle and senior management levels. The second point is accessibility. So I like the fact that you mentioned visas, right? And I'll talk more about that in a bit. But also accessible tourism in terms of how are we looking at ensuring that Africa is ready for tourism for people with physical disabilities, both to come as tourists, but also in terms of how they can work in the industry. And this was a question I put forward to the global CEO of Accor, Sebastian, and he said that Accor was taking that quite seriously, and they have people with visual impairment working in their brand, and it's important that we continue to move this conversation to ensure that tourism is accessible and is inclusive. And I think the final one is about technology. And so what I would say is that I don't want to call them challenges, I want to call them opportunities. And so there's opportunity here for Africa to really differentiate itself. And I would say that the Kenyan minister's submission, talking about how Kenya is looking to be visa-free, just like Rwanda is, to people coming from Africa, right, is also showing that the continent is saying, how do we really start to practice the single market that AfTA proposes? So very, very encouraging in terms of the future of travel and tourism.
Very important conversation that you're having so far. You did mention that you'd rather see these as opportunities as opposed to challenges. There's also the conversation about how it's very difficult. Intra-Africa travel is actually more complicated in some scenarios or in some circumstances than traveling to other continents. Some Africans have complained about the difficulty with which it will take for them to get to another African country, as opposed to, there are certain countries where you have to go to Europe and then come back to Africa. It's almost like make it make sense. So talk to us also, whilst you're maybe touching on that, talk to us about insecurity, which is a huge challenge on the continent in some parts. Here in Nigeria, every once in a while, we're dealing with issues of insecurity, which might impact the amount of travel, even within the country. Yesterday, we talked about Uganda and the unfortunate incidents at Queen's Park where a couple on their honeymoon were unfortunately murdered. So talk to us about, if insecurity is a conversation that has come up in any of the discussions so far, and how it's been handled.
Right, thanks, Olive. So also at the Advisors Circle, right, which we submitted our points. One thing that I would say is that Africa needs to be a stronger part of the global conversation. And so my point in terms of what the focus did not include was safety and security. And when we talk about safety and security, we talk about safety in terms of how accessible is this place, how safe is it, but also security, particularly the perception of security. And I would say again that this presents opportunities for us to look at how to really work on strategies that can enhance the perception of security as well as the enforcement, i.e. when something goes wrong, as I was discussing with a colleague, it's not only about great customer service, it's also about when something goes wrong, how quickly can it be resolved? And so I would say that these are areas that we can work closely with government. I think government needs to take a stronger participatory role in terms of how do we really communicate our focus and our prioritization of the industry. And then I would say as well that it's also about how we tell our stories. I would say that around the world, we have issues of insecurity around the world, right? And this is not to downplay its seriousness. It's also to ensure that we look at this within the context of the global continent or the context of Nigeria. And it's the stories that we tell, it's the stories that we put out there, how we brand our destinations, how we market them, right? These are the ways that can also attract visitors to come here. Something I keep telling people is that, the United Kingdom, the United States, South Africa, different countries around the world all have their security challenges, right? We hear it in the news all the time, but it doesn't stop people from traveling. Why not? Because they understand that there's a perception of security, and that if something goes wrong, they know that serious steps and actions will be taken to address these issues. That is where I would say that we're missing in the equation.
Okay, so talk to us about next steps. Because you could have as many conferences as possible, but if there's no clearly defined pathway, towards achieving these things in maybe a 5-year time frame, maybe 10 years, then we will probably not see anything different. So what for you should be next steps? And we're talking now with Rwanda, with Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt. Some of the major nations on the continent that really should push. What would you say should be next steps?
Right, thank you, Osarogie. And I would say that in terms of next steps, this is something that we've been really thinking about and really strategizing. It's really about how do we upskill the industry in terms of talent, right? How do we look at middle management skills? And what are these middle management skills? It's basically the ability to take strategic decisions. It's also the ability to ensure that you have strong management skills to oversee the entry-level staff and the supervisory staff. So that's one next step that we need to look at. And I would say that countries such as Tanzania, Rwanda again, Ghana are taking this seriously. Nigeria also needs to follow suit. And this is the way that the private sector can get involved. I would also say that for us as Red Clay and looking at the wider industry and our role in the industry in Nigeria and West Africa, we've been very good at bringing roundtables together to discuss certain arenas. But one thing that I would say that we need to do more of is have a stronger network in terms of the small, medium-sized enterprises across the continent. And that's how WTTC started 30 years ago, right? It was 20 CEOs that said, how do we come together in the private sector to really make government take tourism seriously? And it's important that we also do that across the continent so that as an SME base, because the SMEs make up 75% of our industry, it's important that we're talking to each other. It's important that we're speaking with one voice. It's important that we're learning from each other. And it's important that we can help our governments to have the evidence that they need to take the decisions that they need to take to make the industry grow.
Now, this summit is holding in Rwanda, like we mentioned, the first time in Africa. It's held in the Philippines, it's held in Saudi Arabia, and interestingly, it's happening now in Rwanda. Of course, Rwanda is very, very proactive in conversations about biodiversity. Now, how do we, as a country here in Nigeria, because we're looking to push ourselves further, how do we position ourselves in a way that we can start having conversations about sustainable travel, and that will then, position us to be able to potentially host a conference of this magnitude in the nearest future?
Thank you for that, Olive. And I would say, interestingly, I worked with WTTC about 13 years ago, right? And one of the things that I worked on then was policy and research, but also looking at sustainability. And why I mention this is that it's important that we see it as a long-term journey. I think that one thing that we don't really do quite well here is that we want something to happen tomorrow, right? And it's to understand that the journey starts by one step, but it's the incremental step of working with different people. And so one area that I think we should really start to look in terms of sustainable tourism, I've mentioned accessibility already, right? That's under inclusion. It's also how diverse we're looking in terms of the industry. And by diversity, I'm not just talking about gender. I think we're talking about demographics, right? Looking at different income brackets in terms of how we're including more tourists across the line. I would say that there's quite a strong focus that we have now on the upscale and perhaps luxury, quote unquote, tourism. And it's important that we also provide services for people that are coming up. Like President Paul Kagame said, he spoke about the rising middle class, and it's important that we look at the low income and the middle income groups as well. But particularly, I would say we also need to expand tourism to include ages, different ages. There's a strong youth board, which I think is fantastic, and it shows so much for the continent in terms of moving forward. But it's also important that we don't exclude those that are older, right? The elderly, and how do we include them within the tourism industry? How do we include their participation, both in terms of working in the industry, but also as tourists and as travelers? And all of these cascade into actionable steps that we need to, backtrack. And it's important that if we want to get there in 5 years, we needed to have started yesterday, right? Sustainable tourism really is now taking the fore of conversations, but many of the destinations that have gotten it right didn't just start in 1 year or 2 years. They had a 5, 10, 15, 20-year strategy.
All right, as we wrap up this conversation, let's talk about how the industry is faring ever since COVID. The whole world was shut down. We're gradually seeing travel bounce back to the forefront, more people exploring travel. And if we bring this back home to Nigeria, one of the challenges that the tourism sector has faced, or the travel industry has faced, would be the rising cost in aviation fuel. So how are we able to manage this? We've also seen a number of airlines at some point pull out of Nigeria because they've not been able to access their forex, and it's just been a number of challenges that they've had to face that have sort of limited them being able to operate in Nigeria. But the world is starting to open up again. Nigeria is starting to open up again. So how are we able to manage with the financial implications, the financial challenges that we're currently facing? How are we faring?
Right. Okay. So as a global industry, I would say that recovery isn't yet at 2019 levels, and it will be until about 2025 that will happen. This is globally. And in Nigeria, we were actually part of the Lagos COVID-19 Relief Committee. We wrote the report and advised government in terms of the steps to take. And during that, we also conducted surveys with thousands of practitioners within the industry. And for them, it was the sense of how can I address the challenge now, but also how can I address the challenge in 2 years? Because for many of them, they didn't see the industry recovering until 2024, 2025, and this is late 2025. Why I mention this is that when you look at the different challenges that operators, travel agency, tourism companies, hospitality organizations have had to face in Nigeria over 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023. It's a miracle that some of us are still where we are, and it's a miracle that some of us are still existing, right? So we're talking with the Nigerian delegation, just talking about the businesses that have had to, really struggle and really try to survive. Tourism is resilient, right? It's a very resilient industry, but it's very important to learn the lessons of destinations that are doing this quite well. How are we supporting businesses? How are we creating strategies and policies? Yes, we understand that there's a global cost of living crisis globally, right? It's around the world. But then it's important that at this point, this is where public sector also comes in to provide a supportive to provide support and to provide a supportive framework that can chart, okay, this is what's going on now. These are the steps we're taking to help address this. I think in terms of aviation, the aviation industry is also going through its own challenges. You mentioned in terms of intra-Africa travel, but also in terms of how expensive it is to also travel within the continent, but also outside of the continent. And I would say that it's important that policies are driven. I was in Joburg a month ago talking at the Aviators Africa Sustainability in Aviation Summit, right? And it's important that we really start to think about sustainability, yes, in terms of emissions, yes, in terms of how we're looking at the airports and the design of the airports, but also how are we helping business survive, right? They have to survive to be sustainable, and it's important that we don't lose sight of that.
All right. There's obviously a lot of work that needs, to be done, and it to me it hurts that we can have as many of these conversations, but if there's no actual work, if we don't see the value in tourism, and I'm talking in particular about Nigeria now, as much as the conversation is much bigger than us, but if we don't start to put in the work and see the value in it, we may just continue to have these seminars and nothing much changes. But it's a great thing that is happening in Rwanda, and we hope that, you know, the continent picks up a thing or two from there. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay.
No, go ahead. You want to say
to
something?
that there is work. There is not just talk, right? There are people working in the industry, right? It's important to also acknowledge and recognize that, you know, the hotels, the guest houses, the restaurants, the lounges, the airports, they're working, right? But it's a sense of how can we enhance the activities that they're doing? How can we consolidate? How can we amplify? And that's where we're missing that's the gap that's missing.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to having you again and wish you all the best as you explore. We hope you can explore Rwanda before, you know, the conference comes to an end.
Thank you so much.